All right, Heroes to Hive students. This lecture is on honey plants in the Michigan landscape. Now, honey plants in general, this is a talk that was created for Michigan specifically. Most of our students are in Michigan. Those are outside of Michigan. It's the first year that we've had out-of-state students participate. So what we're going to go through today are common honey plants, not necessarily linked to Michigan specifically, but really, you know, these are things that we see a lot in our landscapes here. I will kind of talk about how to assess landscapes in your own area, depending on where you're at, because obviously floral resources are going to be very different across the country. And I'll give you some tips on websites to look at that will give you lists of plants that are appropriate for your region as well, for not just Michigan. So although this is a honey plants talk that is based for Michigan, you will be able to glean a lot of information outside of that. And some principles that you need to really consider as well that are obviously not linked to Michigan specifically. So when it comes down to honey, it's all about nectar and pollen. When it comes to being a good honey plant, what we really are talking about is the quality of nectar and pollen. So nectar being of good quality to produce honey from, and pollen having all the components in it necessary to be beneficial to honeybees, like all the amino acids necessary for bees to be able to produce brood. These are very important things when we consider the value of floral resources. Some floral resources are better than others, and it is important to consider that because especially if you're actually laying out a plot plan or if you're incorporating a honeybee habitat into your farm, these are things that you need to be mindful of. Is not all stuff is good for honeybees. Just throwing flowers out in a field doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be feeding your bees appropriately. So these are some things to consider. And when it comes to the nectar and pollen, well, we've got a few things here. So nectar, and we've talked about this in other lectures, nectar is the carbohydrates. That's the energy that bees need to do their daily tasks. And it's collected from flowers and these floral nectaries, and also extra floral nectaries. So floral nectaries are nectaries that are inside of the flower, and they're usually buried way deep down in the flower so that the bees actually have to really reach to get in there. And the reason that the reason that they've evolved to be in those areas is because the result of a bee having to really bury its head down into a flower is that it gets in contact with a lot of pollen. And the idea of pollination, the reason flowers are offering a nectar as a reward is because they need cross-pollination, and that's where the honeybee comes in. So there has to be contact with pollen in order for that flower to be able to reproduce, and that is the priority for the flower. So they bury these nectaries down deep, really so that bees have to interact with pollen. Now, extra floral nectaries are a little bit different. And this is a picture right here of a bee collecting nectar from an extra floral nectary on bay laurel. So extra floral nectaries are essentially these little holes that are open, usually on the veins of leaves, sometimes on stems, but they're little holes that open up to the vascular tissue of the plant, the phloem, where the sugars are being transported in the plant. The phloem basically is kind of like a tube basically that's transporting sugars up and down the plant as the plant is growing. And these extra floral nectaries are just basically a spot like you see this bee just being able to feed on them. Now, the reason that plants have evolved extra floral nectaries are actually from a defense standpoint. So really, these plants that generally have extra floral nectaries usually have mutualistic relationships with insects like ants. And ants will actually use those extra floral nectaries, just like honeybees do, to produce energy in the form of carbohydrates. But they will not only utilize it, but they will defend a plant that has extra floral nectaries. And so you have these relationships where you have a plant that is producing a reward for an insect, and that insect in return is defending the plant. And this is a very common relationship that we see with ants and plants with extra floral nectaries. Acacia is a great example where there are lots of acacia species that have very close relationships with ants that will defend defend the tree or the bush or whatever it is because it is offering them a reward. Now, pollen is really important as well. And we know pollen is important because that is the protein that is utilized to raise bees. Now, pollen, from a general standpoint, we say protein is really the main component of that. But essentially, it has a lot more than just protein in it. So it's got essential amino acids, and honeybees require 10 essential amino acids to be able to have their full complement of amino acids. Now, essential amino acids, for those of you that are unfamiliar with them, are amino acids that our bodies don't make on their own. So they have to be collected from somewhere else, a food supply from somewhere else. And I did skip that first point. The anther, right up here, that's where your pollen's at. So you can see the anthers right here, and then the nectary in a flower, in this example, is way down here. So the bee has to really bury itself into that flower to get to that nectary. In turn, all of this pollen rubs off onto that furry little body that our bees have. So we've got proteins in the pollen. We've also got things like starch, fat in the form of lipids, lots of vitamins, and then a lot of minerals as well. So pollen is a really, really important component of bee diet, and it needs to have a full complement of these other things to it. So it needs to have the starches, it needs to have vitamins and minerals, and those amino acids are very important when it comes to quality pollen. So like I said a little bit earlier, not all floral resources are great for honeybees, and based on how complete of a profile pollen has based on these attributes will determine how good of a resource it is for your bees. The flowers are really critical to your bees. You know, they really are going to be a driver of success in the form of being able to raise brood and being able to put on honey. So you really need to be considering appropriate flowers for your place. Now, we own 2 farms in our operation at Bee Wise Farms. Both of our farms have had pollinator habitat incorporated into them. And this is not something that just happens overnight. These are long-term strategies, and so you need to make sure that when you're developing your pollinator habitat, you consider not only plant species that are appropriate for your area, but also plant species that you're going to be able to manage appropriately. So, you know, there's certain plants that are better than others, and we're going to go through a few examples of those here. So, setting this up. So I'm going to go through these slides. I've got a selection of plants that I've put together that really kind of, you know, they're not generally native plants. Some of them are, some of them are not, but they're good honey plants. And then there's a couple examples in here that are, you know, in there for specific reasons to talk about certain issues with some honey plants. I will say, so we've got a little bit of a setup here. So the top bar that you see here will go over the time that these particular flowers are blooming. These plants are blooming. So the ones that are highlighted in red are the ones that are the months that we generally see these blooming. Now, these are not hard and fast dates, especially if you're living in Michigan. Boy, we may have snow, tons of snow still on the ground in March, and you may not be seeing red maple blooming at that time. But generally, March, April is the time that you would see that. So these are general dates. These are not hard and fast dates. But what we're trying to do here by laying this out, and you've gotten this in a handout as well, is we're trying to determine what plants we need to get overlapping bloom times. Because what we're trying to do, and when we're developing habitat and we're picking honey plants, is we're trying to make sure that there's food available all year for bees. And in some areas, Michigan being one of them, we have dearths during the season where there's really nothing flowering. And that's generally late July to early August. We usually have a few weeks there where there's just nothing in the landscape to eat. And so if you are able to incorporate habitat into your farm, you can kind of fill in those dearths with plants that flower during that time. So that's the setup for these slides. So as we go through this, you'll see those months changing over the course of the slideshow. All right, so our first one that we see in the season here in Michigan are soft maples. So are things like our red maple and our silver maple. Those are generally some of the first blooming plants. They are really an early nectar and pollen resource. And the nice thing about them is the flowers appear before the leaves. So that's why they're such an early plant, is they've got these beautiful flowers that come up, lots of flowers in very small areas, which is a great quality when you're looking for good honey plants, is lots of flowers in very small areas. Big showy flowers tend to not be very great honey plants. Small flowers in lots and in numerous clusters tend to be really good. And so what we're seeing here on this picture, we've got a halictid bee that's feeding on a red maple. That is not a honeybee. It's a native bee here in Michigan. But basically, those plants are very important early in the season. Now, once those trees start blooming and pollen starts coming in, that is generally when we see the stimulus for the queen to start laying for the season. So she starts laying pretty early in the season, even maybe before we start working them, because these resources are available. Willows. Willows are also an early season plant, early season tree that we see here in Michigan. There's willow species throughout the United States. So no matter what state you're in, you probably have willows somewhere. There's many species of willows across the US. They tend to like to be in wet habitat, so you tend to see them on riverbanks, things like that. They generally bloom from March to April. Like I said, that's flexible depending on the weather. And again, clusters of flowers. So you see this flower here. These are little individual flowers as part of this big flower cluster. And so the bee's basically going to go through and hit every single one of these flowers and be able to take nectar from each one of those and a little bit of pollen as well. So those numerous flowers are really important. Dandelion. So dandelion is a classic spring plant. It's generally when we start hearing beekeepers start talking about their beekeeping season and things getting going, dandelions are usually the first thing that we hear people talking about. Lots of people, won't mow their yards, myself included, because it is an early season forage that's available, and it tends to be pretty numerous in a lot of areas. So it is a pretty important plant in that respect. It's really good in managed areas. So lawns, inner rows like this vineyard right here, where they're just letting these dandelions go. It's really good for managed areas. The reason being is because you mow this, and those flowers are low enough to the ground generally where you don't mow all of the flowers. So it's nice because it's a low growing plant that's well adapted to flowering at low heights. So you can control the landscape and still be able to get the benefit of dandelion. However, dandelion is really not a great pollen source for honeybees. Now, I know that many of you say, oh, well, I see the bees on them all the time and this and that. Well, that is great that you see that. And they do forage very readily on it because there's very little things available during this time of the season to feed on. But what it lacks is 4 of the 10 essential amino acids that are necessary for bees to really be productive. So there's been research on dandelion specifically, where they basically fed bees just a diet of dandelion pollen only. And those colonies cannot survive. They cannot adequately produce brood on dandelion pollen alone. So dandelions, although important, are not a sole resource that can support honeybees. You need to have other things out there. So if you're just relying on dandelions to support your honeybees early in the season, that is not a good strategy. You need to have something else that has a more complete diet for them. Moving on into April and May, this is when we start to see our stone fruits start to bloom. Those are things like peaches, plums, apricots, and cherries. They're called stone fruits because the pit in them is like a little stone. They generally, these are plants that require pollination. So oftentimes, if you're looking for honey contracts, for pollination contracts, these are some of the crops that you may be able to get pollination contracts for, where people pay you to put hives in their place. We ran an apiary that had cherries in it for several years. These plants are great floral resources. I will say there is a caveat to some of this. Generally, we have seen some pretty wet seasons, this season in particular, where bees really didn't have a great opportunity to forage on these plants because it was just such rainy weather while they were blooming. So you can see some years where you get excellent honey flow off of these types of trees. You can also see years where you get very little depending on what the weather is. This also produces crop-specific honey. So if you're looking to do those varietal honeys, cherry blossom honey, it would be an example of something that can garner a premium price. But again, that's something that you would have to really time. And generally how you do varietal honeys, would be like, if you were in a cherry orchard, the way we used to do it is that as soon as cherries start to blossom, we would put supers on that had drawn comb in them, and that was the only super on the hive. And so we would super the hive right when the flow starts, and then right when the flowering ends, we would pull those supers so that we can ensure that, you know, one of the primary resources that they were using were those flowers. Rosaceae plants, so things like apples and pears. Again, same kind of timing as our stone fruits. They also require pollination, so these are plants that you can get pollination contracts on as well. They're excellent floral resources for bees. Our farm in the UP has a lot of apple trees on it, and they're just great. We've also kept bees on apple orchards for years. Really good honey, a light, kind of delicate honey that's produced from apple blossom honey. And again, a honey that can garner a premium price if you're doing varietal honey. Now, it doesn't have to be just solely apple blossom honey. None of our honeys are just solely one resource. But, you know, you can send it in for analysis and see what else is there. But I would say, you know, when you're doing these varietal honeys in big apple orchards, that's the primary resource that's going to be coming in during that bloom time. Bird's foot trefoil. So this is a really interesting plant that has a very interesting relationship depending on what state you're in. So it is a forage legume. It is something that was introduced into the United States because it grows really good on poor soils. So areas like in the UP, where we have some areas that have real rocky, like just not nutrient rich soils, this will grow very readily on, and it's a good forage for livestock. So in those areas where you can't grow alfalfa, you can grow bird's foot trefoil, and it grows in a dense mat, kind of low to the ground. Really takes over areas very nicely. Lots of flowers that are available through there in these areas. So, you know, dense areas of lots of small flowers are a good thing. However, it is classified as an invasive in some states, and it is not classified as an invasive in Michigan, but in some states it is classified as an invasive. And I want to say it's Minnesota or Wisconsin that actually have an eradication campaign going on right now for bird's foot trefoil. So this brings up an interesting point, that not always are honey plants really well suited for particular environments. Some plants that produce really excellent honey and pollen for honeybees are not necessarily well suited for all areas and can be potentially invasive. And so this is one of those that can be potentially invasive. So you need to do a little bit of research, especially if you're out of state, out of Michigan, before you start, you know, throwing out bird foot trefoil seed. It is a perennial. It reseeds very readily, which it goes along with its invasive nature in some areas. But it is a very good forage for bees. I have a friend of mine, Terry Klein, who runs TM Klein and Sons. Every so often, I'll take a trip out to his. He's a commercial beekeeper out in what is the city he's in, near Schwartz Creek. But he basically, they run a couple thousand hives, and I'll go out with him every season or so, and we'll do kind of a ride around to some of his yards. And every time he sees bird's foot trefoil, he stops and points it out, because it's such a good forage for his bees, and he really likes seeing it in the landscape. Alfalfa. So alfalfa is actually a really excellent honey plant as far as nectar is concerned. Pretty poor on the pollen though, so it's a pretty poor resource on pollen. However, it is one of those plants that can be really beneficial, but it depends on the situation. So alfalfa is harvested based off of its dietary fiber content. And oftentimes, if you're harvesting for forage, you cut before the flowers really start coming on strong. So you'll generally get a first cut in the beginning of the season, and then later in the season you'll get a second cut. Now, if you have a producer that's doing alfalfa that's producing it for seed, that space, that area is a very good nectar resource, and they will produce a ton of honey off of alfalfa, because it is just, there's tons of flowers in these landscapes. An acre of alfalfa, it has about 2 billion flowers in it. So it's a ton of flowers for an acre. And they just, it is a very, very good nectar source. Like I said, though, pollen, as far as pollen is concerned, it's a pretty poor resource. Not all the essential amino acids that we need to have. So normally when you're in a situation where you have alfalfa growing around you and they're growing for forage, it's going to be harvested really before the bees can use it. So it's really not a useful resource. But if you are around a seed producer, it is a useful resource from a honey perspective. All right, clovers, and you'll see that I've got these asterisks around clovers. There's going to be a few plants in this lecture that have those asterisks, and the reason they have asterisks is these are the plants that you really want to focus on. These are the top quality honeybee plants as far as nectar and pollen. So there's lots of clovers out there. White Dutch clover, red clover, those types of clovers, they're fine. They're adequate for honeybees. You can see this picture right here of this bee foraging on red clover. Clover, like I've mentioned with other really good honey plants, has lots of flowers in a very small area. That is always a quality that we see with really good honey plants, or generally, I shouldn't say always, but it's mostly that's what we see. You'll see that I have in bold here sweet clovers. Sweet clovers are the best clovers to use for honey production. Hands down, yellow sweet clover by far. If you're going to do any clover, yellow sweet clover is the one you want. And that one will produce excellent pollen, excellent nectar, very high amounts. A big acreage of sweet clover will produce a lot of honey. So really, really good. The nice thing I really like about clovers, and particularly the sweet clovers as well, is that these are used extensively as cover crops across the United States. So if you're a farmer looking to put a field into cover crops to help repair soil or improve soil, yellow sweet clover is a great option, and you're going to get great honey out of it as well. Many small flowers on those plants, like I said previously. Milkweed. So milkweed is an interesting plant. Milkweed is something that we associate with pollinators, particularly monarch butterflies, which their larvae have to be raised on milkweed. They have a specialized diet for that. So it is a really good pollinator plant. However, and I should have said this a little bit earlier, not all of these are excellent honey plants. Some of them are put in here because I really want to impress upon you that not all plants are created equal. So milkweeds, they generally bloom kind of early to midsummer, June to July. They are a great nectar resource, but there's an issue with the pollen that goes along with them. And even though it has large flower clusters, which is good, we've talked about that, that's good for honeybees, there are some issues with pollen. And it comes down to the pollen sac and how it's shaped. So you see this picture here at the bottom. This is the pollen sac off of the milkweed plant. It's kind of this horseshoe shape. And what ends up happening is that horseshoe shape doesn't come off like a normal pollen grain. And so it comes off in these sacs and essentially can get tied up on the tarsi, those claws of the honeybee's feet. I encourage you this summer, when you're out and about, if you have milkweed in your landscape, just look at the flowers as you're passing by. I've done research in fields where milkweed is just everywhere. And when I pass milkweed, every so often, what you'll see is a bee like this right here that is stuck to a flower. And it's stuck to the flower because of the horseshoe pollen grain is not coming off easily. And so you'll actually find dead bees hanging off of milkweed flowers sometimes because they just weren't able to dislodge that pollen grain. So that can be a little problematic. You're not seeing tons of bees that this is happening to, but it's an interesting kind of, an interesting, I'd say, it's an interesting kind of caveat to this particular flower is that it's a good nectar resource, but the pollen can actually cause some issues. But like I said, it's not something that is causing tons of bee death, but it is something just to be mindful of. But in general, a pretty good nectar resource, or a great nectar resource. Basswood, also known as Linden. So basswood is, got the asterisks around it. It is an excellent, excellent honey plant. If you have the option to plant a grove of any kind of tree, basswood would be my pick. And in fact, we have plans here next year at BWise Farms North. I'm actually working from my UP office this month, where we're planning on putting 100 basswood trees into our back lot on the back 40 of our property. The reason being is when this plant blooms and you stand under this, it literally is raining nectar down on you. They have tons of flowers, produce just a tremendous amount of nectar. The honey has kind of a unique taste to it, almost like a kind of a minty flavor to it. Our apiary in Lansing that many of you have visited is actually about 2 miles from a basswood planting on MSU's main campus. It was put in the 1970s, and we get basswood honey pretty much every year. Very unique flavor, really premium product. When people taste basswood honey for the first time, it's like you've opened a whole new realm of possibilities when it comes to honey flavors. Pollen and nectar are super abundant. These trees, when they're in full bloom, you walk underneath them, not only is it raining on you, but the entire tree is vibrating because it is just full of bees. An excellent, excellent tree. If you have the opportunity to plant any kind of tree or anything, or have any space to plant one of these, I would highly recommend planting basswood, American basswood. Fantastic tree. Knapweed. So, knapweed, spotted knapweed, also known as star thistle. This is a really interesting plant, and something that the beekeepers and conservationists have been battling over for years. So it is invasive, absolutely. Star thistle, like I said, also known as knapweed. Star thistle just really takes over areas. It produces basically toxins in the soil that makes it outcompete other plants. So other plants actually can't germinate in the area that star thistle is in. So you will see this take over acreage very, very rapidly. In the West, I'm originally from California, Central California, the Central Valley, some of those foraging areas, it is just taken off, and it is a big problem. Even here in Michigan, we've got areas where when this takes hold, it just takes over the landscape. Now, conservationists hate this plant, and it really causes a lot of issues from outcompeting native species of plants and really can disturb ecosystems. However, from a beekeeper standpoint, this is an excellent forage. It produces absolutely fantastic pollen and nectar in high amounts, oftentimes in areas that really don't have a lot of good floral resources, things like prairies, or I shouldn't say prairies, things like grazing pastures where cattle are put on. A lot of times you don't really see any flowering species in those areas. These things will absolutely flower in really disturbed habitats like areas that have heavy grazing. The problem, again, is that it outcompetes other plants. And so it is a real big issue. This is not something you're going to plant. But if it's something that is in your area that, just happens to be taking over, you're going to take advantage of it, and they're going to produce good honey from it. And it is a good resource from it. But this is not something that you're going to plant in your landscape. So just be mindful of that. Buckwheat. Buckwheat is a really great plant to have in your landscape, particularly for the late season. So buckwheat usually comes on blooming like late July, early August through mid-August. It really is kind of nice because a lot of folks will plant it as a food plot for wildlife during the winter. So you get kind of a twofer there. You support your honeybees in the front end on the front end of this, and then on the back end during the winter you're supporting wildlife that's going along with, so deer, turkeys, things like that. Fantastic honey, and it really has a niche market for the honey. So the honey, if you've never seen buckwheat honey, kind of has this molasses look to it and almost like a molasses flavor to it. It's very dark in color, very desirable. A lot of folks really, really like buckwheat honey, but then on the flip side of that, a lot of folks really hate buckwheat honey. So, but it does command a premium price. Generally, what I've seen in the marketplace, pound honey jars of buckwheat honey, usually somewhere between $17 and $20 a pound. So it is a premium honey. One of the also nice things about buckwheat is it attracts beneficial insects. So if you're growing crops on your farm and you want to control the pest insects that are causing issues on your crops, planting buckwheat around the area is good because it actually will promote a lot of the beneficial insects like predators and parasitoids that will feed on your crop pests. So incorporating this into any habitat is a good idea. Really great resource. Goldenrod. So goldenrod in Michigan is one of the last things that we see flowering in the season. And it can really be dicey if this is actually a good resource or just does nothing for honeybees. And it all depends on how much rain we get in the late season. Some years here in Michigan, we'll have dry late seasons. And basically that means that goldenrod will flower, but it doesn't produce much nectar. When we have good rains when we're going into September, generally we see very good nectar flows coming off of goldenrod, and you can really get some good honey off of there. It is one of those flowers that has these long spikes of tons of flowers, so great in that respect. The honey is amber and has kind of a spicy flavor and can be a varietal honey if you've got a good nectar flow on with that. And really it is the last resource of the season, particularly here in Michigan. All right. So those are just a selection of honey plants that I wanted to cover today, just to give you an example of what are some good honey plants, what are some plants that might be good honey plants but may have invasive properties, all of those kind of good things. But essentially, what you're trying to do by identifying all of these plants is that you want to create a system and a habitat on your land where there's always something available to eat. And so this is a table that I created based off of things that we wanted to put into our landscape. And we haven't done all of these, but we've done some of them as we continue to build our pollinator habitat on our farms. And what I did is I made a list of plants that I knew were good honey plants and things that I wanted in my land. Now, there are things in there like, there are some invasives in there like star thistle. Well, star thistle doesn't happen to me in our area, but I just listed it on here. But it's just mainly to give you a good idea of how we get overlapping bloom time. So you can see here, the idea is when we plot that out over a table, we start with our soft maples in March and April. And then from that point on, if we were to have all of these plants in our landscape, and some of these are crop plants, you can see like plum, blueberry, basically over the course of the season, there will always be something available for our bees to eat. And that's what we're going after. So you can create a table like this very easily based off of what's in your area. I will say this though, you need to really kind of take stock of plants that are important to honeybees and be able to identify them, because essentially you're going to want to analyze what's in your landscape already. If you've already got good resources in your landscape, you may not need to add some of these. But you generally want to make sure that you have those overlapping bloom times. And I'm going to give you a few examples. You've got this table is part of the handouts that was sent to you as part of this lecture. And I also wanted to give you this website as well. So for those of you that are out of state or in state, this is a really great website that you can take advantage of. It basically goes through and has all sorts of plants, their timing, properties of the plants, and how long they bloom, things like that. This is all offered through a NASA website, and it really is a fantastic resource. So you can see here that they have bee forage regions. You can click on your region, and then it will give you a list of plants that are appropriate for your region. So that's a really great place to start if you're brand new to this and just wanting to actually incorporate some habitat into your landscape. In addition to the handout that I sent you with the table that I created, I also am sending you a Xerces Society handout that is particular for the Great Lakes region, but those of you that are out of state, you can go to the Xerces Society website page, and there are a ton of resources for the entire nation on pollinator plants. And they give you pollinator lists, just like I gave you today, that are appropriate for your region. So that is the Xerces Society. That is Xerces Society. So I'd encourage you all to look that up and take some time on that page. There is a ton of great resources there. All right, so things to consider about your apiary. So we want to make sure that the plants that we have in our apiary are appropriate for our bees and are giving a good resource for our bees. So you need to assess your forage. And what I do generally when we open up new apiaries in locations is I will pull up Google Earth and I will look at the area. And generally with Michigan, especially if you're in ag areas, you can kind of tell what's going on in those areas. Like, a soy and corn farm, they look like a particular way, and it's pretty easy to drive down the road once you identify that there's a plot somewhere and look out into the field and see what's growing. So you want to kind of get a sense of what's going on in your area. I look at a 3-mile radius because that's generally the flight radius of honeybees. And so just kind of assess what's in the area. I generally will take a piece of a notebook and go out into the field and actually drive around the areas where I'm putting bees and just kind of tick off what are some things that I see. Now, I'm not counting, you know, the one maple tree over here. I'm looking at large sections of resources. So, for example, if I see like a big section of autumn olive, that's a good indicator, because autumn olive actually produces quite a lot of honey. So, you know, those types of things. Or a field where I saw goldenrod. Now, this is not something that you can just do once. You're not going to just go out once and assess the floral resources in your area, because the floral resources change over time. But you want to kind of assess those over time so that you get a good idea of what's available. And then you can fill in the gaps if something is not available. If you know that, you know, all I've got is goldenrod and a bunch of soft maples on this property, or, you know, within 3 miles of me, I've got to fill in that middle season with things that flower during that time. I recommend developing a plot plan, particularly if you're going to be incorporating pollinator habitat into your landscape. Develop a plot plan and decide what you're going to be putting in there, and how you're going to orient that into a space. Determining bloom times is really important, and that goes along with understanding the forage resources that are available in your area. And this allows you to ID weaknesses in your resources. So if you know what's going on in the area, you can definitely look and see how you can fill in those gaps. All right, with that, I'll say thank you. I hope you enjoyed the lecture today, and take a look at those handouts. I would definitely encourage spending some time on the Xerces Society website page as well. Have a good one.